The weather forecast on TV said that heavy rainfall was expected across the country due to an approaching cyclone. For those people who were planning to go on a hike, this, of course, was not the best news. As the young man took the food out of the food container, he thanked Old Lady Smith for this wonderful treat. And a few minutes later, everything that the guy brought with him today was already in the frying pan. Arthur, watching each piece sizzle as it cooked, was clearly pleased with the result. While the food was being prepared, the young man had time to have a cold beer. The guy was really enjoying himself, because in his situation it didn't matter at all what kind of weather awaited everyone else. At some point, he suddenly heard his name and an announcement that guests had arrived for the picnic he had organized. Turning to the new arrivals, Arthur immediately replied that he had enough food with him, which would be enough for everyone. And from the nearby thickets, a man armed with a sword had already emerged, who was cheerfully asking whether his friend had thought to bring some alcohol with him today. Following this man, humanoid creatures appeared from the same thickets, which looked more like mutated cats. A few seconds later, a certain old man with a staff appeared, who did not fail to notice that something new in the world of cooking awaited them today. With words of apology for intruding into the company's rest, the elf girl soon approached the clearing, accompanied, as always, by her magical creature. Arthur wasn't worried about the weather forecast for one simple reason. He was now in the company of his new friends in a completely different world. After leaving the car and examining the rather old building, a young man named Nigel found it to be quite well preserved, even though this property was owned by the grandfather of his dear friend, who was still in the car for now. And while Nigel was wondering whether the most famous chef in their country had really decided to open a restaurant in this backwater, his passenger asked him to make sure once again that there was no one else around. He looked out of the car with apprehension, fearing more paparazzi, but Nigel noted that no paparazzi would even think of dragging themselves into such a wilderness. After looking around again and listening to his friend, the young man reached for the mask on his face. Pulling it down, Arthur noted out loud that there was some truth in Nigel's words. From the outside, of course, it might seem that Arthur suffers from a mental disorder in the form of persecution mania. But it just so happened in his life that he was actually able to gain quite wide popularity. After all, he graduated from one of the best culinary schools, and soon after, he won first place in a culinary competition in Paris. In a very short time, he gained recognition, and all the most popular TV shows tried to get Arthur on their show. The young man's popularity grew so much that fans literally burst into the kitchen in an attempt to get an autograph or touch their idol, which wasn't really liked by the guy's other, less popular colleagues, who were only distracted from work by these fans. Very soon, evil tongues began to spread not the most pleasant rumors about Arthur on the internet, where they expressed doubts about his abilities, calling him simply a hyped-up boy. Returning home and reading all this blackness about himself every day, the young man literally began to fade away. As he walked inside, Arthur listened to his companion's words about how he wouldn't earn much here, and his recommendations to think carefully about his decision. When the chef replied that he was not there to earn money, but to relax, Nigel became interested in why he would open a restaurant, to which his interlocutor immediately explained that cooking was the best relaxation for him. Once the things were brought inside, the young man suggested that they have a snack before starting to tidy up and unpack the boxes. There was no delivery service here, so the friends found a small and not very popular cafe. Nigel watched with interest as his friend tasted what they had been served for snack, where, a moment later, he had to calm Arthur down, who demanded that the manager be called, since such food could only be fed to pigs. Nigel himself noted that the sauce in this spaghetti didn't really taste like anything. But the whole problem was that Arthur couldn't actually taste the sauce, or the pasta, or any other food. At some point, the young man noticed with horror that he had lost his sense of taste. At the doctor's appointment, he received an explanation that medicine was powerless here, since the reason for the loss of taste was rather psychological, and therefore the young man should first of all eliminate sources of stress from his life. Where the man talking to him recommended that the guy look for some kind of hobby to distract himself. Returning to his thoughts about the profitability of the enterprise, Nigel again noted that in such a remote place, his comrade's business would definitely not go uphill, to which he immediately explained that it would be hard to imagine a better place to go hiking in the forest. Sitting in the car, Arthur mentally went through everything he needed for the trip, trying to figure out if he had forgotten anything. The driver asked the young man where he was going, to which the young man immediately explained that he wanted to spend some time alone in the mountains. Noticing Arthur's appearance, the driver noted that he could use a tent. This is exactly what the young man did not think about at all, falling into a stupor for a moment. The man, with a smile on his face, stated that there were no tents for sale in this village when Arthur asked him to stop. Having collected his things, he continued on foot. celebrating the fact that he had come here for the first time in a long time after burying his grandfather. Approaching the house, the young man noted that he would definitely need to clean everything up before leaving. But then his thoughts were interrupted by the door creaking behind him. Deciding that someone had broken into the pantry, Arthur carefully approached to catch the thief red-handed. But his plans were disrupted by some rustling in the bushes, which made the guy literally jump on the spot. This incredibly scary creature, which scared Arthur to death, turned out to be a very ordinary cat that looked out from the bushes. Having calmed down a little, the young man said out loud to the cat that he was very lucky and that he was only a cat. The door inside was already open, and Arthur walked in, trying to find how to turn on the light here. At the same time, he immediately noticed that the space inside this storage room was much larger than it might seem from the outside. Staring into the blackening void, the young man continued to move inside. At some point, Arthur suddenly felt a gust of wind and noticed a glow appearing before his eyes. In an instant, a real abyss appeared before him. With the next step, the edge of this cliff broke off, and the young man felt his body begin to fall forward. And now he was flying with a wild cry into the very center of the abyss that had opened up before him. When Arthur opened his eyes and felt a solid surface beneath him, he immediately wondered where he was. The young man experienced a real primal horror when he felt something wet touch his hand. Turning around, he saw in front of him some kind of creature that was somewhat reminiscent of a squirrel, but with incredibly large ears. And suddenly this creature, with the help of those very ears, soared into the air right before the eyes of the astonished Arthur, leaving him on the ground to watch his graceful flight. Before the young man had time to recover from the initial shock, his nervous system was tested for strength by some new sound behind him. This time, a very ordinary rabbit was looking at him from the nearby thickets, which calmed the guy down. But when this creature straightened up and showed itself completely, Arthur immediately realized that this rabbit was clearly of some completely different level. Without paying any attention to the guest, the rabbit folded his hands behind his back and left the company of the young man in long leaps. Of course, everything that was happening could not leave Arthur indifferent, where he, experiencing real horror, rushed to look for a way out of this strange and scary place. Time passed, and daylight gradually came to an end, giving way to twilight and approaching darkness. Having exhausted his last strength, Arthur mentally came to the conclusion that he was definitely finished, since there was no connection here, as well as no way out of this god-forsaken place. At some point, he remembered the doctor's words about the young man trying himself in outdoor recreation. Forcing himself to calm down, the guy noticed that even in this situation he felt very hungry. Within minutes, the young man was able to start a fire. However, this was only half the matter, where next he began to consider everything that was lucky enough to be with him in this place. As it turned out, everything most basic and necessary remained in another bag, the location of which was now unknown. But there was no choice left, and the young man began to prepare his modest dinner. Quite quickly, the mushrooms at his disposal were in a frying pan covered in sunflower oil. After frying them, all that was left to do was add a little salt and pepper to get a completely acceptable dish. Although as a chef, he could hardly call what he had just prepared a full-fledged dish. But hunger took its toll, and so the first portion of fried mushrooms went into his mouth. But no matter how much he hoped for a positive result, the miracle did not happen, because, as always, Arthur did not feel any taste. A feeling of despair washed over the young man with renewed force, forcing him to throw the frying pan with mushrooms aside. There was a gaping emptiness inside the guy that he couldn't fill with anything. Another rustle in the bushes forced Arthur to come out of this state of complete stupor and devastation. Turning around, the young man discovered with horror that several pairs of burning eyes were staring at him. Assuming that it might well be wolves, Arthur began to feel around for the only weapon he had. Noticing a fanged mouth in the bushes, he immediately noted that he would hardly be able to do anything significant with his penknife. Realizing that he was most likely finished, he closed his eyes and put his armed hand in front of him, preparing to receive the first throw. But time passed, and no one attacked the guy or tore him to pieces. Having calmed down a little and plucked up his courage, the young man finally decided to open his eyes. To his amazement, he noted that no one was looking at him from the bushes, or trying to hunt him anymore. Before he had time to wonder why the wolves had scattered, he suddenly heard someone fiddling with his frying pan. Turning slowly and carefully, the young man tried to see the one who had just cleaned up the remains of the cooked food. This creature turned out to be a very cute-looking little puppy, who was wagging his tail very intensely. Having already turned around completely, Arthur, in a state of yet another stupor, looked at this unexpected guest. The puppy looked at him, and he looked at the puppy, wondering where this little dog came from. Not at all afraid of the person, the puppy went about his puppy business. Well, Arthur himself tried to determine what kind of breed it was, and he was most inclined to think that it was a Siberian husky. The puppy seemed to be very happy to see the man, approaching the guy and even putting his paw on his leg. Trying not to look at the puppy, the young man told him to go away if he had already finished his modest dinner. But a few minutes later, he was already hugging this cute creature in his arms, not understanding why everyone was so drawn to little puppies. While petting the animal, Arthur noticed that its fur was unusually stiff, which was probably a consequence of living in the wild. Then he began to look more closely at the outline of his face, his paws and claws, and at some point, his night guest suddenly made a short howling sound, after which the young man concluded with horror that he was now holding in his arms not a dog, but a wolf puppy. Not only did he find himself in an unknown place, but he also met some wolf there, who now did not leave him. Looking around fearfully, Arthur wondered if the puppy's mother or other wolves from his pack were nearby. After all, a mother wolf may misinterpret the situation and decide that a person has kidnapped her cub. But time passed, and no other huge and terrible wolves appeared. Stress and general fatigue took their toll, causing the guy to stretch out right where he had just been sitting. As he fell asleep, he came to the conclusion that death was inevitable for him, either from wolves or simply from hunger. In his sleep, he felt the wolf cub dragging him somewhere, deciding that he himself had decided to keep the man for himself as a snack. But at some point the pull stopped, forcing the guy to pay attention to where the animal had dragged him. Looking under the tree, Arthur was amazed to find a place there similar to the one where he had fallen. At the same time, the young man was in a state of indecision, wondering whether he would be able to return if he entered this emptiness, or whether it would become even worse. Turning on logic, the young man thought that this passage most likely leads to another level lower, and does not guarantee a return home. His furry four-legged friend watched from the side as he was tormented by doubts, who suddenly jumped up cheerfully from his seat, heading straight towards Arthur, whom he hit with his head at full speed right into the fifth point of support. Falling into the void, the young man cursed the wolf cub he met, who literally pushed him into the abyss. Plunging into it, he had no choice but to scream hysterically once again. At some point, Arthur felt that the fall had stopped, and a solid surface appeared beneath him. Opening his eyes, the young man was amazed to find himself in his own world next to that very storage room. With tears in his eyes, the guy noted that he had managed to survive in these completely incredible circumstances. Getting to his feet, Arthur noted that in that case he should have thanked that wolf cub. Looking at the sky, he promised to never forget his kindness, even though they were never destined to meet again. However, a moment later his peripheral vision caught a white spot located to the left. Returning home with his new friend, the boy wondered why this little animal had gone with him. But there was nothing to be done, and the first thing Arthur decided to do was to bring the wolf cub back to order after life in the wild. When the water procedures were finished, the boy and his new little friend lay down to rest. From incredible fatigue, the young man plunged into the world of Morpheus in a matter of seconds. The night passed rather quickly, and now Arthur was sitting on the bed, stretching pleasantly and shaking off the remnants of sleep. He clearly felt how well he had slept. Looking at the wolf cub who continued to lie around, the young man noticed that he hadn't slept so well in a long time. After his morning water treatments, Arthur decided to feed his pet from another world. Coming to the conclusion that wolves are distant relatives of dogs, he placed a bowl of dog food in front of his guest, which the little wolf demonstratively refused. Realizing that dog food would not help here, the young man decided to try offering the wolf cub cat food or rabbit food. But his white, blue-eyed guest flatly refused even these delicacies for the animals, leaving the guy completely bewildered. Deciding to leave the idea for now, Arthur headed to the kitchen to make breakfast for himself. When the dishes were ready and tasted, the young man regretfully concluded that his taste had never returned. Suddenly, at some point, the puppy sitting on the floor, which the young man decided to call Bublick, jumped onto the table and began to eat all the food that was there. At first, Arthur was indignant about the behavior of his guest, but then he began to observe what he was doing. As it turned out, the wolf cub chose which dishes to eat and which to ignore. The young man could not understand why Bublin refused the chicken dish. After watching the top's actions for some time, an interesting idea came to Arthur. He quickly cooked and placed 2 steaks in front of his guest. He used the best meat to prepare both steaks, cooked them the same way, but served them with different sauces. He topped one with a store-bought sauce, and for the other he used a sauce he made himself. And so he literally shouted for Bublick, who had proven himself to be a true gourmet, to choose which steak he would eat. The wolf, like any animal, began by sniffing the meat in front of him. The organizer of this experiment watched with interest what choice Bublick would make, and so the little wolf greedily began to gobble up the steak, which was covered with store-bought sauce. Having finished with it, Bublick went to another plate where the second steak was. Wagging his tail even harder, he quickly dealt with the second piece of fried meat. Looking at the contented little face, Arthur noticed that this little wolf was clearly an unusual animal. And you definitely won't be able to feed this funny pet just anything. The young man spent all his free time trying to bring this place into a normal and attractive appearance. While applying paint to the wall, the young man noted out loud that the paint was laying down in a very strange way. All this time, his little pet from another world was constantly nearby him. The guy's attention was drawn to someone's words that this was interior paint, and not for building facades. The man who approached also noted that modern youth have not even learned to understand paint. Looking at the uninvited guest, Arthur asked him who he was, and his interlocutor explained that he was the headman of this village, who did not wait for the new tenant, and came to say hello himself. Then he approached the wall and after a short examination of the brushstrokes, concluded that the guy didn't know how to paint either. The old man did not ignore this, and Bublik, who came closer, noticed that this dog was somehow strange. While saying that he would send the boy an assistant, the headman tried to pet the puppy, but it rather deftly dodged his hand. Of course, the young man asked his interlocutor not to bother himself and not to take up other people's time. But the old man, whose name was Patrick Brutman, insisted on his own, recommending that the boy not make any plans for the weekend and not touch paint at all anymore. Such persistence greatly irritated the guy, but he had little choice, and so Arthur agreed to help. The guy the headman brought with him introduced himself as Ron Oliver, and his companion added that he was the son of one of the local farmers. Very surprised that Patrick had actually brought someone, Arthur introduced himself in response. While the old man and Ron were discussing how best to treat the walls before painting, Arthur brought drinks. He could not understand why these people, who were completely unknown to him, were showing such concern towards other people's property. At some point, Patrick asked what the young man was planning to open here, and Arthur immediately explained that it would be a restaurant. Upon hearing that a catering establishment was planned here, Ron immediately turned to the chef, where he was interested in whether they planned to introduce pork cutlets into the menu. Already sitting at the table, he told us that his dear wife loved these very cutlets. The cafe where they were made closed, and he tried to make the cutlets himself, which didn't work out very well. Listening to this guy's story, Arthur thought that in fact he definitely didn't plan on including a dish like pork cutlets on his menu. Besides, it was quite problematic to serve visitors food whose taste was completely unknown to him. Thoughts were already creeping into his head that the idea of a restaurant was completely in vain, when he suddenly noticed the top sitting behind him. As he looked into his clear blue eyes, an idea began to form in the boy's head, and suddenly he jumped up from his seat, shouting that he could definitely do it. Looking at Ron, the young man happily declared that he could cook pork cutlets for his wife, where he is ready to participate in making her feel that forgotten taste again. Soon he was in the kitchen, studying everything Ron had told him about pork cutlets. At some point he realized that a village cafe would definitely not use tomato paste. Therefore the tomato flavor was most likely just ordinary ketchup. Once the analysis of the records was completed, the chef prepared all the necessary ingredients to prepare the dish. His small and very devoted animal was always by his side, who was only glad that the man was once again starting to cook. Armed with a vegetable knife, Arthur immediately set about creating what he had promised to please Ron's wife with. Pretty soon the first pork cutlet was already in the frying pan, its breading becoming more and more golden. When the dish was ready, Arthur carefully watched the movements of his taster's tail, which seemed to him to be slower, indicating a slight error. After some time, the young man prepared a second cutlet, which he also sent to his partner for tasting. The movements of the tail this time seemed too slow to the guy. Arthur repeated his procedure several times, which his little guest was only happy about, having eaten his fill. The chef himself was very pleased that with the help of Bublik, he could now cook calmly without even feeling the taste. Sitting at the table, Ron asked his wife how she was feeling today. The girl was pregnant, and replied that she felt very well, adding that she was very happy to visit the new restaurant opening in their settlement. But most of all, the girl was happy that she would finally be able to feel that same taste of pork cutlets again. And so the young man who approached the table said that he would be only too happy to serve the lady in this way. Turning her attention to the plate he had placed on the table, the girl immediately noticed that the cutlets smelled incredibly delicious. Without a second's hesitation, she immediately used the utensils and sent the first piece into her mouth. Both the chef and the girl's husband watched with bated breath the reactions of the first taster of this cuisine. At some point, the girl suddenly said that the cutlets in that old cafe were incredibly tasty, but it is unlikely that any other cuisine could compare with what she had just tried. The girl noted that even the meat itself was incredibly juicy, with a delicious crispy crust. Her words that she had never tasted such delicious cutlets in her life were the best gratitude for the cook. After a while, the girl suddenly plunged into memories of the past, asking Ron if he remembered their first date, After all, on that date they also ordered pork cutlets, which the guy didn't eat because he couldn't take his eyes off his future wife. Listening to his wife's words about how his hands were shaking that day, the young man even felt a little embarrassed. And so the girl revealed the secret, saying that it was after that first date that she fell in love with pork cutlets, to which she had previously been completely indifferent. Where it's not so much about the cutlets themselves, but about the memories that their taste evokes. Arthur, standing nearby and not interfering in the couple's conversation, simply looked with affection at this loving couple. At some point, he turned his gaze to the four-legged assistant lying nearby, concluding that he had definitely overfed him today while trying to find the perfect taste. But at the same time, he was incredibly grateful to Bublik for helping him so much. When the young man was alone again, he began to think about the specifics of his restaurant's activities. He decided to move away from his original plan to open a restaurant with Italian cuisine, deciding to cook what his customers wanted, which was difficult, expensive, but quite feasible. At the same time, Arthur noticed that his four-legged friend had fallen into some strange state. It was like some kind of peculiar depression, the cause of which the guy could not yet understand. After some time, he began to find an explanation in the fact that the wolf, most likely, simply missed his native forest. After all, this little animal came from another world, in which it should be comfortable to live. Having come to the conclusion that Bublik needed to be returned home, Arthur was already imagining how empty it would be here without him. And even though that world was filled with the strangest and even seemingly scary creatures, the guy firmly decided to take the top back. However, until the last moment he postponed this foray into another world, which he truly feared. Hearing Arthur's reasoning about his house, Bublik immediately became active. His pleading gaze left the young man no chance to avoid another visit to another world. And although this really wasn't very pleasant for him, soon Arthur and his faithful little top were already in the very world where they met. Looking around, the young man noted that the sooner he finished here and returned, the better it would be. Literally feeling the close attention on himself, he sincerely hoped that this sortie would end well for him. As he slowly moved through the forest, the boy wondered what kind of place this was, and whether it could be some kind of parallel world, like in the movies. Feeling the very fresh air, indicating the presence of water, the young man began to make his way through the thickets. He was stunned and froze like a statue when he saw what suddenly opened up to his gaze. This combination of forest, mountains, and clear blue water, playing with reflections in the rays of the sun, created an incredibly beautiful landscape. Without taking his eyes off the lake, Arthur noted that he too would miss such a beautiful place. Bublik was really very happy to return to his world, approaching this clean and transparent body of water. Sitting down next to him, Arthur said that he would soon leave his friend, but before that he wanted to give him a little surprise. Reminding the wolf how he helped him prepare cutlets, the guy pulled out a camping barbecue. Bublik's mouth immediately started to water when Arthur pulled out tender and delicious pieces of meat from his backpack. Having greased the heated surface with butter, the young man prepared to place the meat on it. While the meat was frying, he salted it and seasoned it with spices, thus frying a whole plate. Watching Bublik actively wagging his tail, the young man grinned and warned him not to accidentally fly away. While the wolf was gobbling up the meat, Arthur turned around and looked at this beautiful view once again. He then turned his attention to the camping barbecue in front of him. And when he returned to Bublik, who continued to savor the meat, the thought came to his mind that something was missing to complete this luxurious setting. A moment later, he had already pulled a cold jar out of his backpack. After all, with such a delicious view and fried meat, beer was very appropriate. After taking a few sips, the young man experienced a strong feeling of disappointment. After all, he realized once again that his taste buds had not yet started working. At the same time, he noted the opinion of some people that alcohol is not drunk for the taste, so he enjoyed what he could enjoy, until suddenly he felt cool steel at his neck. Glancing sideways at what had appeared to his left, Arthur mentally noted that he was looking at the tip of a real sword. Well, the one who was behind him for now menacingly asked who the guy was, a sorcerer or a spy from other countries. The frightened Arthur could not utter a word, and the man continued to insist on an explanation as to who his random encounter was. The sharp edge of the sword's blade pressed into the guy's neck more and more, forcing him to feverishly think about what he should do. And so he finally plucked up his courage and declared that he was just a cook, and there was nothing suspicious about him. Not believing what was said, the man asked what an ordinary cook would do in such a place, and the young man shouted that he was simply enjoying the view, begging for the weapon to be removed from his jugular vein. But the man didn't believe it, and started shouting and threatening to cut the guy's throat if he didn't tell him the purpose of his visit. But when he saw a wolf peacefully chewing meat on the sidelines, his speech suddenly stopped. He couldn't believe that he was seeing this white wolf cub in front of him now. Well, Parov continued to beg for mercy, offering to give the man money, hoping only that the currency in this world was the same as on Earth. He didn't even immediately notice how the sword blade was at some point pulled away from his vital body part. Putting his sword back into its sheath, the man suddenly apologized for his excessive suspicion, explaining that an ordinary person had no business being in these places, teeming with all sorts of monsters. The man then introduced himself as a knight of these lands named Kogemion, asking his interlocutor to introduce himself as well. Astonished by such a sudden change in mood, the young man told the knight his name, and he explained that since the guy was accompanied by a white mythical wolf, he definitely couldn't be malicious. Where Kogemion was quite surprised that this young man did not understand at all what he was talking about. And then the man explained that the white wolves inherited the blood of one of the ancient gods. Myths and legends say that the white wolf has the ability to see good and evil, and is also endowed with great wisdom. It has long been believed that the race of white wolves inherited part of the power of an ancient deity. This is exactly the kind of wolf that is next to the guy now. These explanations amazed Arthur, who could not even imagine that Bublik was a real descendant of God. At the same time, this fully explained how the little wolf behaved with others, not allowing them to touch him. Noticing how his interlocutor was deep in thought, Kogemion noted that the guy was most likely mistaken in his conclusions. But then he turned his attention to the guy's explanation that he was just having lunch there, noting that eating in such a picturesque place would definitely be perceived differently. Having noticed the plate, the knight asked what kind of meat it was, and immediately received the answer that it was beef, and an offer to try it. To this Kogemion stated that he would like to say that he was already full. But this was not at all the case. He noted to himself that he would not be able to refuse food with such a pleasant aroma, even if he really was full. Displaying excessive modesty, the man said that he would only try one piece for the sake of decency and respect for the chef. Standing opposite, Arthur watched with interest as the big guy put the first piece straight into his mouth. When Kogemion began to chew, his face changed dramatically, where he did not understand how meat could be so tender and tasty that it literally melts in the mouth. Having come to the conclusion that nothing like this could be found in their world, he suddenly noticed what the guy was holding in his hand. To satisfy his new acquaintance's curiosity, Arthur explained that it was a light drink. But Kogemion was interested not only in what was inside the vessel, but also in the jar itself, which he called a strange mug. Trying to contain his impulse, the man said that he was simply curious and did not want to try at all. But a moment later he grabbed the jar, saying that he couldn't refuse when Arthur literally put it in his hand. But the guy stopped the knight's impulse, explaining that he had already taken a sip from this jar, offering him one that was not yet opened. He watched with great interest as his new acquaintance tasted the beer from his world, where he came into incredible delight, loudly noting that beer simply could not have such a rich taste. Arthur mentally noted that just a couple of minutes ago this man was holding a sword near his throat, and now he was behaving like an old friend. Having thanked the boy for such an incredible treat, Kogemion said that if Arthur came here again, he should definitely find him in order to give him the opportunity to thank him. Where he must tell anyone he meets that Kogemion, captain of the Knights of Alagard, is needed. It was very unusual for the young man's ears to hear such outdated titles or positions, and while Kohemius was confused by the fact that the boy was not at all impressed by his rank, Arthur himself tried to reconcile this with his world, suggesting that the captain of the knights was probably someone like the company commander. Then the knight added that he would like to advise the young man to be careful, since all sorts of things happen here. But since he has a white wolf with him, there is nothing to worry about. While Bublik was begging for a new portion of food, Kogemion took his leave, citing the fact that he needed to continue patrolling. Arthur didn't even have time to say anything in response, silently watching the knight leave, who finally expressed hope for a new meeting. The guy's thoughts revolved around the fact that his random encounter was a knight captain who was patrolling, and this meant that this soldier had just gotten drunk while on duty. Turning his attention to the wolf cub who continued to beg for food, the young man came to the conclusion that in another world there might be different rules for serving. After which, to the delight of the bagel, he dumped into its bowl everything that was left of the meat he had prepared. It was with pleasure that I watched the wolf cub gobble up his next portion. While he looked at Bublik, he remembered all those few but very happy moments with him that filled his life, where now the guy was incredibly sorry to part with this funny guy. As he got ready, Arthur noted that although it had not been a long time, it was one of the happiest in his life. Noting that he could not be sure of their new meeting, the young man wished his four-legged friend good luck, after which the guy turned around and walked away, leaving the bagel to finish his last meal prepared by Arthur. After taking a few steps, the young man turned around a little to see how the top was behaving, but he didn't show it, continuing to gobble up everything that was still left in his bowl. This behavior of the animal made the guy sad, After all, he hoped that even though they hadn't been together for very long, Bublik had also managed to become at least a little attached to him. And a moment later the young man discovered that after the meat was finished, there was no trace of the wolf cub. After looking at the lonely bowl for a while, Arthur turned around and, filled with sadness, continued on his way. And suddenly he felt how the backpack on his back noticeably gained weight, and now he was already trying to detach Bublik from him, trying to explain to him that it was his property. After some time, the backpack was practically torn to shreds, where its owner did not understand what kind of demon had entered the top. But he suddenly came up and began to lick the hand of the one he recognized as his own. Well, the young man could not understand why Bublik was following him when he himself had recently wanted to return to his world. He asked him the appropriate question, but of course did not receive any direct answer. Bublik just sat and looked at the guy with his pure, kind, and joyful eyes. Then Arthur began to guess that the wolf found it much better to be in his company than to live alone in this world. Reaching out to his four-legged friend, the boy noted that last time Bublik left him no choice, going with him to his world. And this time he also doesn't leave him a single chance to return home without him. Having already returned to his world, the young man noted that now he would have to periodically visit the top's world, so that he would not become sad. As he moved towards the house, he noticed that sometimes having picnics in another world wasn't so difficult. At some point, he noticed how the people gathered in the clearing were having fun. He just doesn't understand why these ceremonial events are taking place right next to his house. And then the boy's return was noticed by the village elder. In response to Arthur's questions, he explained that the residents had organized a festive dinner here, about which he should have been warned. Explaining that no one had told him anything and did not report anything like that, the young man added to himself that even if they had reported it, he certainly would not have taken part. At this moment, one of the locals reported to Patrick that a sign had just been delivered. Arthur meanwhile tried to slip away, but the old man stopped him, saying that even without an invitation he could and should have fun with them. He did not immediately understand the words of his interlocutor, that the hero of the occasion must necessarily take part in it. And when the young man turned around, he saw an unfolded poster with words of greeting addressed to him in honor of his arrival at the settlement. The people who had gathered really decided to have a great time, organizing something like a mass picnic. Well, the culprit of this unplanned celebration who appeared immediately became the subject of everyone's attention. From all sides, all sorts of compliments were showered on the guy, while Arthur himself was only thinking about how he could get out of here as quickly as possible. Noticing the corresponding expression on the face of the one who had prepared the delicious cutlets for her, Linda asked that the people not bother their new friend too much. And when the guy asked whether the locals greeted every new resident in the same way, she explained that their settlement was small, and therefore everyone knew each other well and lived very amicably. But after listening to several loud toasts, the girl added that this was definitely not a reason to get drunk. Soon the elder intervened in their dialogue, noting that true strength lies in the unity of the people. Getting very close to Arthur's ear, he also added that this was an excellent opportunity to advertise the opening restaurant. This statement greatly surprised the young man, who did not believe that this old man had organized all this just to help him promote the restaurant. A moment later, he noticed that Patrick was covered in bottle caps. Looking at the general behavior of this man, who had already managed to leave to continue the fun, Arthur mentally noted that he had hardly interpreted his intentions correctly, which at the same time did not prevent him from actually advertising the restaurant. Sitting to the side, the young man watched as those gathered were genuinely having fun and relaxing, where, despite the fact that they saw each other almost every day, they always had something to talk about. Slowly sipping his beer, Arthur couldn't take his eyes off these wonderful and kind people. At some point, the young man noticed that his faithful Bublik had stopped hanging around nearby and had started looking for him with his eyes. Well, the little top meanwhile successfully enjoyed the attention of those gathered, which, of course, was reflected in the fact that he was fed quite a lot. But as soon as someone tried to touch the sacred white wolf, it immediately retreated from the touch. More than once attempts were made to pet or pick up this cute creature, but none of these attempts were successful for anyone present. People were amazed at how skillfully this little puppy dodged every attempt to touch him. But Bublik didn't keep himself waiting when another plate of food appeared in his field of vision. Not limiting himself to what was brought to him as a treat, he moved like lightning from one table to another, sweeping everything that was on the plates off them, where Arthur even felt a little ashamed of his little pet's behavior, where he even thought about the fact that this little rascal really needed to be left in another world. Lost in his thoughts, the cook didn't notice how his gaze suddenly stopped on a boy sitting alone to the side. This was the first child he had seen in this settlement since his arrival here. This boy looked very sad and lonely, which Arthur thought was a consequence of the lack of other children to be friends with and play with. Suddenly, an elderly woman approached the boy and brought him some kind of package, but only after seeing what she tried to give him. The guy suddenly became enraged, literally knocking the bundle out of the old woman's hands. Where Arthur, who was observing the situation from the side, did not like his behavior at all. The elderly woman tried to reason with the guy and stop him, but he quickly jumped up and ran away. When the headmistress asked what had suddenly happened to Peter's behavior, who was usually a normal and calm child, the woman explained that he had become like that since yesterday after returning from school. He told me that one of his classmates bragged about trying a real American burger, and she tried to buy something similar at the supermarket, which turned out to be completely different from what Peter wanted. Arthur listened attentively to this dialogue, instantly realizing that the boy simply did not want a burger from the supermarket, which really wasn't very tasty. Someone from the crowd suggested going to a burger joint to satisfy the child's need, but his impulse was instantly calmed by Patrick's words that there were definitely no burger joints to be found within a radius of at least a couple 100 kilometers, after which the crowd immediately began discussing where the nearest burger joint was and how a burger differs from a hot dog. Meanwhile, the headman turned to the boy's grandmother, saying that if they couldn't buy a burger, they could make it themselves. And when the old lady noted that she was not particularly good at this, Patrick immediately reminded her that they now had a real chef from the capital at hand. Arthur couldn't even imagine that this whole story would ultimately lead to all attention being focused on him. Of course, the headman apologized for forcing the young man to cook a burger like that, but the boy had already come to terms with this inevitability. Well, his interlocutor added that the young man does not necessarily have to repeat the taste of an American burger. After all, Peter is most likely just jealous that his classmate went somewhere with the whole family, while the boy's mother is in hospital and his father is on a business trip in another country. That's why he thinks that the burger has nothing to do with it, and that it's more about the boy's loneliness. Having listened attentively to everything that the old man told him, Arthur made him understand that he had heard what was said. The headman also noted that now all hope in this situation lies only in their new resident, the chef. Looking at Patrick, Arthur mentally noted that this old man really knew everything about everyone here and understood a lot. Despite the fact that he is a big fan of drinking and behaves very strangely, hanging himself with corks and empty bottles like war trophies, turning his thoughts to solving the problem at hand, the young man figured that making a burger wasn't that difficult. But he himself has never visited a burger joint, and therefore has absolutely no idea what an American burger should taste like. While he was thinking about what to do, his little pet was lazily checking his plate for food. Arthur felt very uncomfortable when he heard people annoyedly eating the only side dish left on their plate, cursing the unknown person who ate all their meat. The young man understood that he would have to try hard and cook the best burger at least to compensate for the actions of Bublik, who destroyed all the meat. The young man told the hooligan himself that he would not get another piece today. Before Bublik had time to get upset, the guy immediately added that he would still get to try something today. Soon the first test burger, which Arthur prepared looking at the picture in the advertisement, was ready. But it seemed to the young man that his taster was not wagging his tail very intensively. It was obviously a complete failure, which gave the chef pause. He recalled how he started his career as a chef, traveling to other countries on exchange programs to gain experience. Always and everywhere he was inspired only by his love for cooking. Arthur wondered what the driven guy he once was would say about him. The answer to the question came instantly and made the guy feel ashamed of himself. Inspired, the young man turned to his four-legged friend, expressing his hopes that there was still room in his stomach for testing. After which he stood up resolutely, putting on an apron and preparing to create the best burger in the whole wide world. Remembering the headman's words that the taste should not be completely repeated, Arthur declared out loud that he did not know how to cook like that, and would not. Pretty soon, a burger patty was finishing frying in a hot frying pan, with a piece of cheese quietly melting on it. After a few more minutes, all the burger ingredients began to be layered on the bottom of the burger bun. Peter, already invited to the restaurant, sat silently at the table, not expecting anything good from this venture. He was accompanied by his grandmother, as well as the Oliver family, where Linda noticed that the kitchen was emitting a delicious and incomparable aroma of burgers. But the boy still couldn't believe that now he would be able to enjoy a real American burger, which appeared in front of him after just a few seconds, accompanied by words of gratitude for the wait, which the chef said when serving. Absolutely officially, as required by restaurant ethics, the young man said that the customer's order had been fulfilled. The appearance of this burger alone made Peter very surprised. Well, the delicious and very appetizing aroma left him no chance not to try what was standing right in front of him. With the very first piece, the guy literally felt like he was in one of the popular burger joints that the United States has always been famous for. What he just tasted was hundreds of times better than a supermarket burger, which the guy immediately told his grandmother. And the old woman was only glad that her grandson was finally happy. But suddenly the boy's face became incredibly sad again, where he turned away and said the word, "Mom." And then he explained to the astonished old lady that by demanding a good burger, he was counting on a trip to the capital to visit his mother in the hospital. It was only for this reason that he so strongly demanded a burger not from a supermarket, but from a burger shop, which he now deeply regrets. With tears in his eyes, Peter begged his grandmother to forgive him for this lie. But the woman was not at all angry with her grandson, perfectly understanding how difficult it was for him without his parents. Hugging the boy close, she began to apologize for not noticing earlier how much he missed her. A moment later, this boy, who at first seemed completely ill-mannered to Arthur, burst into tears, screaming that he really missed his parents. For a while, the young man simply watched the scene unfolding in his restaurant, and at some point he attracted Peter's attention by saying that he was soon going to go to the capital, inviting the astonished boy to join him on this trip. This proposal was surprising not only for the child himself, but also for his grandmother. When asked for clarification, Arthur added that they could also go to a real burger joint, which he had also never eaten at. Naturally, the boy was very pleased with such a generous offer, which he accepted with great pleasure. While he was thanking Arthur, Linda said that Peter should definitely take lots of photos of this trip, which she would be happy to look at later. Well, today's savior of the situation was mentally thinking that he still had no idea why he would go to a place from which he himself had literally just escaped. But looking at the boy's shining face, the young man understood perfectly well that there was no turning back. That's why he said again that they would soon go on this journey together. When everyone had left, Arthur returned to the kitchen, looking into the refrigerator. After looking at the shelves, the young man noticed that he had a lot of food left over that could soon spoil. Turning his attention to the stretching public, Arthur brought up the idea of going on a hike for himself to discuss. After all, when the restaurant starts to function fully, he won't have so much time for trips. Suddenly the young man noticed how his little white friend became active upon hearing about the trip, who literally began to shine with joy at the realization that they would soon be going to his home. Looking sideways at his pet, the young man declared that there was no talk of going to another world at all. But after some time, Arthur, in the company of Bublik, was already in the very world where they met. The young man noted that he began to visit here much more often than even the grocery store. But it was definitely worth it, as the natural views here were truly amazing. While he was busy assembling the tent, Bublik happily chased the butterflies flying past. Soon the tent began to take on its normal shape, which was given to it by the correctly installed poles. But some mistake was still made, and at some point the entire structure ended up on the grass again. However, the guy did not give up trying, and after some time he achieved a positive result, setting up the tent correctly. Stretching out on the grass, he noticed that putting up the tent was much more difficult than he had imagined. Only now did he realize that he was incredibly hungry. The field kitchen was set up quite quickly, and a very appetizing lunch was prepared. Having put his portion on the plate, the young man prepared to begin the meal. But he was not allowed to enjoy the food properly because of the intent glances of the animals that came to the delicious aroma. Surprised that these squirrels could eat meat, the young man threw them a piece each to try. But his gift did not have time to reach these small creatures, as it was intercepted right in flight by some other creature living here, which, without delay, continued its further journey through the air. Arthur had enough meat, and soon the local squirrels were enjoying its taste. The guy himself mentally noted that he definitely wouldn't be bored in this place. As he lounged in his folding camp chair, he noticed that doing nothing could be quite enjoyable too. And suddenly he noticed that his faithful Bublik, who was constantly hanging around him, had disappeared somewhere. Having decided that the wolf would definitely return as soon as it got hungry, the guy decided to simply continue resting and eating. The young man had not yet noticed that someone had been watching him closely for a long time from the nearby bushes. Hearing a rustling sound, the young man decided that his four-legged friend had finally returned. Showing a plate filled with meat, he called Bublik to begin the dinner meal. But what suddenly burst out of the thicket could not help but frighten the guy who was expecting to see his top. With great difficulty, Arthur managed to remove his hand with the plate from the trajectory of the creature rushing towards him, which meanwhile turned out to be quite agile and quickly stopped the movement of its body, turning around. Now the young man had the opportunity to examine this new, uninvited guest at his picnic, where it was completely obvious that this was not the Bublik he was expecting. After all, right in front of him, some female individual of an unknown species was grinning and showing obvious aggression. In part, this unprecedented creature resembled a human child, but the situation was radically changed by her tail and ears, which turned the girl into something like a big cat. Continuing to hold the plate of meat in his hand, Arthur came to the conclusion that this was some kind of mutant, where this mixture of man and cat looked very frightening, continuing to grin. The young man didn't even have time to notice how his uninvited guest made a new attempt to pounce on him. But this time too he managed to dodge this cat's attack, and the little cat person herself again turned around quite deftly, using her clawed paw. Mentally noting that Bublik was never there when he was most needed, the guy began to call on the creature to be reasonable. He told this cat girl not to get excited, because everything can always be resolved peacefully, without bloodshed. But then he noticed that her gaze was directed not at him, but at the plate of meat in his hand. Realizing that the animal was simply hungry, Arthur placed the plate on the grass, telling it that it could eat and then leave. Still looking at the young man suspiciously, the cat girl slowly walked towards the plate of meat, where the first thing she did was check the contents with her keen sense of smell. And when her sense of smell indicated that it was something very tasty, the uninvited guest began to eat without using her front paws. But as soon as she chewed the first piece, she immediately felt a real fire engulf her oral cavity. Watching the cat girl roll around in the grass, Arthur remembered that his dish had turned out to be quite spicy. The fire in the cat's mouth slowly died down as the boy tried to offer her some water, and a few seconds later, from the expression on her face, one could conclude that she was savoring the taste. And indeed, the aftertaste left by this piece of meat transported the little girl to a paradise of taste sensations. This is what made the cat girl get up and approach the plate to try to continue her meal. For Arthur, it was very surprising that she continued to eat meat despite the fact that it was very spicy. This allowed him to conclude that his unexpected guest liked the treat. At that moment, Bublik, happy with his walk, appeared from the bushes, whose attention was immediately drawn to the cat girl who continued to devour his food. The wolf would definitely not tolerate such an insult, and would immediately pounce on the one who left him without food. Shocked by Bublik's behavior, Arthur tried to stop this sudden confrontation. The young man called on everyone to remain calm, saying that he had prepared a lot of food, and there was enough for everyone. But as soon as he pulled one back, another participant in the fight immediately rushed into battle again. But at some point something happened that the young man never expected to see. A creature that appeared nearby suddenly stopped the movements of the little cat girl. Having tucked it under its armpit, the creature turned around and asked the man for forgiveness. After which, with one powerful leap, it left the clearing where Arthur was trying to rest from all the hustle and bustle. As the creature walked away, the young man wondered how many different species of intelligent beings lived here. After finishing another foray into another world, Arthur and his faithful assistant were cleaning up the restaurant. After all, the young man had planned the official opening of the restaurant for tomorrow. Of course, he came here primarily for psychological relief and relaxation. But if he opened an establishment, then there needs to be order there. Meanwhile, an elderly woman was walking down the street past the restaurant and noticed the bright sign. Arthur listed everything he needed to do to ensure the opening was successful, and when his reflections and calculations were finished, he joyfully concluded that he was completely ready for the discovery. At that moment, the same woman who was passing by happened to be inside the restaurant. Looking closely at the guy, she asked him if the establishment was open. Switching to the guest, the guy began to say that the official opening would only take place tomorrow. But when he met the old woman's persistent gaze, he had no choice but to invite her to sit down. And so the woman began to move around the room, closely examining literally everything that was around her. Referring to the furniture, she noted that all this old stuff could have been thrown out and replaced with new. Then the woman began to examine the walls, ceiling, and windows. And finally, I came to the conclusion that this place as a whole remained the same as before, although the wallpaper was a different color. While dressing in his work clothes, the young man asked her if she had been there when another establishment was located here. But instead of answering the question, the strange old woman asked the guy what dishes he was going to cook and serve here. To this, the young man explained that, in general, they planned to serve Italian food here, like pasta and pizza. Pushing back her chair, the woman said that if by pasta they meant spaghetti, then that was what she was ordering. And when asked what kind of pasta she would like to try today, the guest said that she would leave the choice to the chef. Having accepted this strange order, Arthur retired to the kitchen, where he immediately began preparing the dish. Deciding that Grandma had never tried pasta before, he decided to make the most popular version of pasta with tomatoes. Since he had prepared this dish hundreds of times, it wasn't long before the plate of pasta was sitting on the table in front of the woman, and the young man obligingly wished the lady bon appetit. He couldn't personally judge the taste of what had come out, and so he relied only on his extensive experience. While the woman tasted what he had prepared, he recalled how often the pasta he had prepared had been praised, and therefore he did not allow a single thought to occur to him that it might turn out tasteless. But suddenly the old woman stopped eating, asking the young man how much she owed for this dish. At that moment, A familiar male voice was heard from behind the front door, noting that the sign on the restaurant was bright and attractive, which would ensure good attendance. And so, opening the door, the headman asked Arthur if he was there today. When the old man asked, the woman who was leaving explained that she had come in to have a bite to eat, adding that this is usually what people go to a restaurant for. Patrick was very surprised, because the opening was supposed to take place only tomorrow. But the woman said that she had already managed to have a bite to eat here. Having seen her off with his eyes and noticing her not very good mood, the man walked into the hall, where the owner of the establishment stood at the table with a lost look. Turning to the guy, he asked whether this woman had really ordered and eaten something here. But Arthur did not answer the question, as he could not take his eyes off the plate, which remained almost full on the table. When a customer leaves the food untouched, this was the worst possible assessment of the chef's work, who now could not understand where he had gone wrong. Patrick, of course, couldn't help but notice how upset the guy was. Coming closer, he asked what the problem was that had thrown him so far out of his normal rhythm of life. Without answering the question directly, Arthur told the headman not to pay attention to what was happening. But what struck me most was the old man's announcement that from today he was closing the restaurant. To continue the conversation, the old man invited Arthur to sit down more comfortably, where he immediately noted that the problem, apparently, lay in the way old lady Ricarda Smith had behaved. He tried to say that it is impossible to please everyone and that the guy is a world-renowned chef, but that did little more than inspire. Then Patrick changed tactics, noting that she hadn't come here for food at all. Arthur was very interested in who was a frequent guest when the cafe was located here, and his interlocutor explained that he was talking about Ricarda's husband, who practically lived in this cafe. But it so happened that a year ago this woman's husband died. After this, she spends most of her time at home, completely alone, and greatly misses her late husband. But the dead are at peace, and the living need to live on and not cling to the past. To sum up what was said, Patrick stated that it was not the guy's fault. It was just that the old woman was picky about everything because of her condition. These explanations made the young man think hard, where he could not just take and forget about this woman. The guy thought best in solitude, and so he decided to go back to the other world. Perhaps it was the bublik, but there was not a single dangerous monster left nearby, which meant he could concentrate on his thoughts. Naturally, the guy's thoughts revolved around that old woman, information about whose life now made him feel sorry for her. But despite this, it was surprising that she hardly touched one of the dishes he had most honed in his preparation. The young man was just thinking about preparing some other dish for her when he heard a noise above his head. Raising his head, the young man saw the cat girl he already knew, who had settled on one of the branches of the tree under which he was sitting. It was impossible to tell from Arthur's face that he was very glad to see this uninvited guest again. But the guest herself was in no hurry to go down this time, carefully watching the one who had treated her to a tasty and spicy dish last time. Deciding that this time the cat girl would not cause him any unnecessary trouble, the guy began to organize a picnic. While the young man was busy with preparations, the girl plucked up courage and climbed down from the tree. Pretty soon the whole area began to fill with the aroma of roasting meat. Taking out the red pepper, Arthur suddenly remembered how his guest had reacted to this seasoning last time. Along with the meat, the young man prepared a kind of side dish, part of which were mushrooms. Next came the pasta and grated parmesan, which formed the basis of the future side dish. First, the plate was filled with pasta and mushrooms, on top of which was placed a juicy, well-done steak. The cat girl continued to show her animal character when the young man placed a plate with a prepared dish in front of her. Of course, the uninvited guest really wanted to try the food, but she was stopped by the memory of her past spicy experience. But hunger was stronger than fear, and so the cat girl, closing her eyes, sank her teeth into the steak. To her great surprise, this time the girl was transported by a gamut of taste sensations. It was an incredible taste sensation that literally made this little creature meow. Arthur stood and watched intently as the cat girl gobbled up everything that was on the plate. When she finished, he could tell from her appearance alone that she really liked it, and that the guest would definitely not refuse more. And in general, this humanoid cat now looked much happier than at their first meeting. The guy himself didn't really like this type of pasta, since it turned out quite greasy due to the butter and steak. It would be hardly possible to call this dish traditional pasta. Suddenly, he felt his guest gently rubbing against his leg, noticing that just recently she had been ready to tear him to pieces. Seeing his guest's positive attitude, Arthur even decided to caress her a little with his hand. Now the young man understood that it didn't matter whether the traditions of preparing a dish were followed, as long as the customer liked it. Lost in his thoughts, he even stopped stroking his guest, which greatly surprised her. Already at home, inspired by his meeting with the cat girl and her reaction to the pasta he had prepared, Arthur began cooking. Having chosen the best greens, The young man called Bublik so that he, as the main and only taster, could express his opinion. But as it turned out, the little wolf was not at all inspired by the fact that he needed to taste the greens. Watching his friend turn away, the young man came to the conclusion that this time he would have to make do with his own strength. This created certain, but not the most critical difficulties. After all, he remembered the taste of every ingredient he was going to use, and he couldn't rely on Bublik's help forever. Patrick approached the restaurant and read a notice that the restaurant's opening had been postponed until next week. Old lady Ricarda Smith sat in her yard as usual, not talking to anyone and often turning her gaze to the sky. At some point, her attention was drawn to a familiar male voice expressing his satisfaction with the fact that she began to go outside more often. The mayor also added that Ricarda needs to go outside as often as possible, but the woman greeted him without much enthusiasm, asking rather rudely why the old man had come to see her at all. The man then said that Ricarda had managed to greatly upset that cook by not eating the dish he had prepared. To this, his interlocutor stated that she simply did not like the noodles, and therefore she should not have finished them. She was very surprised by Patrick's offer to visit the restaurant again, in order to give the guy a chance to rehabilitate himself. To her objections that once was enough, the headman added that this time everything could be different. Laughing, he also noted that it wasn't that far from her house to the restaurant for a short walk. Continuing to insist that she give Arthur another chance, the man turned around and headed for the exit, leaving the elderly woman soon in her usual solitude. Meanwhile, the young man stood and examined the result of his efforts in preparing a new dish. He liked the combination of ingredients he decided to use, where this paste included not only greens but also seafood. While he was thinking about how he could now invite the old woman to a second meal, the bell on the front door rang, and Ricarda, who appeared on the threshold of the establishment, asked whether the restaurant was open. Arthur was very glad to see the one he had just been thinking about inviting again, inviting the woman to come in and sit down. Having accepted the offer, Ricarda sat down at the table, thinking about what he would serve her this time. She had absolutely no desire to try again that pasta that she didn't like at all. But suddenly, her olfactory receptors sensed some incredibly pleasant aroma. Before she had time to understand what smelled so delicious, a plate with a dish from which this divine aroma emanated suddenly appeared right in front of her. And Arthur, who delivered it to the woman as usual, thanked the visitor for waiting, noting that this dish is part of their restaurant's special menu and is prepared only in exceptional cases. Taking the chopsticks and examining what was on the plate, the woman could not help but notice the presence of seafood there. Thinking that perhaps this would be a little better than the last spaghetti, Ricarda tried it. At that very second, she was practically transported back to the past, to the springtime that she and her husband spent together. Having plucked a flower from a tree, the man suddenly handed it to his dear wife. Making the woman feel embarrassed, he accompanied his gesture with a question about whether she was free today and would like a cup of tea. Continuing to feel this incredible taste, Ricarda turned her gaze to the tree branches hanging outside the window. While wrapping a new portion of pasta on sticks, the woman noted that this type of pasta had definitely not been planned for the restaurant menu before. When the guy confessed that this dish was prepared for the first time today, Ricarda immediately concluded that Arthur did it especially for her. And when asked why he had to try so hard, the young man explained that he simply wanted to give the woman pleasant emotions. He also added that he himself would like to continue developing, constantly trying something new. Having finished his explanations, the young man thought again about the fact that this time he tried to satisfy the visitor's taste without Bublik's help, which was a big risk. But suddenly the young man noticed with surprise that Ricarda had no intention of leaving, continuing to eat the new type of pasta. The woman sent one portion after another into her mouth, enjoying this incredible taste. And when there was nothing left on the plate, she asked how much she had to pay for this pasta. Completely shocked, Arthur answered haltingly that he would not take money from the woman for this treat. But she was not at all happy with this state of affairs, where she insisted on payment, since every work must be paid for. The second time, Ricarda shocked the guy by declaring that he should definitely take money for such divine food. In addition, the woman recommended adding this dish to the restaurant's regular menu, explaining this at least by saying that he was going to come here exclusively to eat this kind of pasta. Absolutely pleased with how well everything had turned out, Arthur sprawled out in a hammock in the vastness of another world and watched the unknown birds flying above him. Its first visitor was absolutely satisfied. The restaurant can be considered open, which means it was possible to rest and relax a little. Bublik needed to visit his home, and so the young man found this an excellent opportunity to escape from the usual hustle and bustle of his life. Making himself comfortable, he loudly announced the beginning of complete relaxation and rest. But before he could finish, suddenly some dark spot flew right over his head, and Kogemian, who had peeked out from the bushes, cursed in annoyance. noticing that his prey had disappeared. But the prey not only disappeared, but also managed to completely disrupt the atmosphere of Arthur's rest, which the knight saw before him. Looking at the guy lying on the grass, the man cheerfully noted that they hadn't seen each other for a long time, asking the guy how things were going. Soon, they were sitting opposite each other, talking about everyday trifles and about the fact that the guy had come here often because of the beauty of the world. When the young man asked whether Kogemion was on duty today, he explained that he was simply hunting today. As soon as the little wolf cub heard the word hunt, he immediately beamed and became attentive. And suddenly Arthur's interlocutor also became inspired, saying that this time he would feed his friend, inviting a guy and his little pet to go hunting together. Of course, the young man was not at all interested in any kind of hunting, which only interfered with his planned vacation. But he didn't even notice how he was already accompanying the knight, armed with a bow and arrows. Bublik, on the contrary, was incredibly pleased that he had the chance to take part in the hunt. When Kogemion said that they would be hunting jumping birds, Arthur was very surprised, as he had never heard of such things.